My name is John Reneden. I am the founder of the Reneden Foundation, and we connect people and businesses with resources to help come back from this pandemic. Our tagline is Get Help, Give Help. We try and put the people together or businesses together with both the resources that they may need in order to come back after this pandemic. We keep seeing people hurting more and more every day, and we just want to help with that. Please visit therenedenfoundation.org to get help or to give help to those in need.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Woodruff. I'm a health reporter at the Times-Picayune New Orleans Advocate. And today we have a mental health panel to discuss how coronavirus has impacted not just physical health, but also mental health. So the realities of the pandemic, the isolation, financial stress, childcare, virtual schooling, hurricanes, these are a lot of different stressors building. And there are studies that show we're struggling with it, and I know, beyond that, we all feel it as well. So I have three excellent panelists with me today to help us navigate these questions. And so I'll go ahead and introduce them. We have Dr. Charles Figley, director of the Tulane Trauma Institute and expert on disaster-related mental health. Hello, Dr. Figley.
Hello.
We have Dr. Samantha Francois, Executive Director of the Tulane University's Violence Prevention Institute and Assistant Professor in the School of Social Work. Dr. Francois researches adolescent development and resilience in Black populations. Hello, Dr.
Hello,
Francois.
everyone.
And we have Dr. Michelle B. Moore, an Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at LSU Health New Orleans. Dr. Moore specializes in complex trauma and infant, child, and adolescent mental health. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to talk to each of you individually, and then we're going to devote a good chunk of our time to questions that readers have already written in with. So I'm going to just jump right in. I do want to say if you're experiencing a mental health crisis right now, there are resources for you. You can call 911, tell them you're having a mental health emergency. You can also call the suicide prevention hotline at 1-800-273-8255. So we have a lot to cover today. So Dr. Figley, I'm going to start with you. We talk a lot about trauma, right? Which sounds like a violent sort of word. It sounds like it's something big. But what is it really? I want readers to understand what trauma is.
It's simply a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that lasts a relatively short amount of time, but it has an impact on us. It's an emotional shock. So consequently, as an emotional shock, we're worried. We try to do as much as we can about the situation. But at the same time, you're still, churning inside, a lot of anxiety.
Would you know that you're going through trauma as you're going through it?
Good point and good question. Yes, your body feels nervous. It's shaking sometimes. There's a wide variation depending on the individual. But yes, you are uncomfortable. You're afraid, typically. You worry about those around you, especially those that are dependent upon you. It's not a fun time to be, to have this kind of experience. We have difficulty sleeping. We constantly reevaluate. We ask 5 questions. What happened? Why did it happen? Why am I acting the way I am at the time? At the time that I first discovered it, why am I acting like this weeks later? And what if this happens again? Will I be able to survive? So there is this tension, this homework that we have to deal with and go through. It's not fun.
And so I wonder if an event that affects one person traumatically would not affect someone else. Like, are there small triggers for some people that can be considered traumatic and other people are okay with them?
Absolutely. It's very true. And it's very challenging because when you want to protect the population and enable them to move on, it's hard when one person explodes and another person shuts down, for example. But yeah, there's a huge variety of examples, but much of it is associated with fear, and confusion, uncertainty.
Are we all sort of going through trauma right now? This is, as I said at the beginning, we're experiencing all these events on top of each other.
Well,
are we collectively going through trauma?
exactly. That's what I was going to suggest, that this is collective trauma. This is a trauma that happens to a collection of people. And there are multiple traumas, as you know, going on right now. I was talking before the production about the California fires and how horrible and terrible it is, and the clear evidence of global warming. So it's not a fun time.
And, just seeing the California fires, can you experience trauma that, you're not going through? Do people pick up on other people's trauma in a way that adds to our own?
Yes, great question. It's secondary trauma. Primary trauma is when you're in harm's way. Secondary trauma is when you're trying to take care of people in harm's way, or if you're afraid that you're going to end up in harm's way. So it's either primary or secondary, but we have had this forever. As long as there have been human beings, we've had this kind of phenomenon. And I think people are probably, there's no one, as far as I know, that lives today that has avoided trauma. It's almost impossible to avoid. But in New Orleans and elsewhere, we're getting used to it. I mean, we have anticipated. I saw an interview with someone saying that, hey, we in New Orleans are used to this. We're accustomed to this. We know exactly what to do. That's true, absolutely, without a doubt. I love the city, but it's a little too much to ask that, oh, we're used to this. Even though we know things are probably going to be okay, we're still worried about it. And we're not just worried about ourselves, as I said before. We're worried about people that we love, that we care about, that are around us.
And you bring up a good point that the city has, a history of trauma. We've notably Katrina, which you have studied in depth. And people are still going through that. So yes. Something like this, I wonder if what you've learned with Katrina, what can you tell us about the long-term impact of all this coronavirus, financial turmoil, everything that's going on? Nobody
knows.
Oh.
We've never had such an experience. And as a matter of fact, those of us who are researcher types, we've been very busy this summer in terms of collecting. Certainly the panelists have been busy also. So in terms of what we know, we're all going to get through it. There's going to be a certain population that will not get through it very well and will remain traumatized. But for the most part, people are going to pick up and move forward, as you're aware in New Orleans. When I came here in 2008, that, oh boy, there has been a lot of damage, in the 3 or 4 years since Katrina. And there are certainly pockets that developed and sprung back, partly because they could afford to. They were wealthy, or at least they had access to resources. But at the same time, it was a real challenge for most people. But at the same time, as we are challenged, as we are potentially traumatized, etc., it teaches us something. And what I'm always pushing for in my research and my presentations is to get people to listen to their body, listen to and take in all that they have been exposed to, and come to a realization that they're in many ways not only safe, but they're smarter now as a result of these experiences.
So as we're going through this, we can know that it's making us, smarter. It's making us stronger. Is there anyone who that's not really true for, that they don't get through the trauma to the point where they have become stronger for it? They remain in that trauma?
Yes, absolutely, without a doubt. I would say it's smaller. There's a smaller percentage than most people would realize. But yeah, absolutely. There are people that have mental disorders already before any kind of traumatic event. There are young children that don't understand this. There are folks who are physically ill and can't really comprehend this. So there are a lot of situations, but probably 20 to 25% are those that have longer term problems, and probably about, I would say, half of them can acquire resources that enable them to get through it.
Okay, and I want to talk to you about the idea of fatigue that we're all feeling related to this trauma. It's called, compassion fatigue or despair fatigue, where, someone had told me, oh, there's a hurricane coming and I can't even really bring myself to do my normal preparations beyond like the bare minimum because I'm so tired of disasters. So what is that, and how can you push through that, or how does it affect us?
Well, compassion fatigue is the fatigue of being compassionate. So that's one thing, because if you are traumatized directly and you have a mental disorder or a physical disorder, that's that. But for compassion fatigue, it's all kind of worrying about other people. And this is particularly true for those who are practitioners, those who work in medical communities, that work in emergencies, first responders. Those folks are definitely at risk. And that's one of the main reasons why we have been studying this for some time, and why we initiated a survey online, so that those of people who recognize this and see this as a problem can potentially send it out to other people and share that, and give them instructions on how we can acquire the knowledge that they have.
And so those are our frontline workers, often our healthcare workers, essential workers. Those people are more likely to experience this compassion fatigue. Yes,
and also social workers.
Yes.
I work in the School of Social Work. I'm a psychologist, but I'm very proud to be in that school. It is very, very challenging for practitioners, especially practitioners who are used to going to an office and taking care of people, but then they have to stay home and only see their clients by way of video. And that's extraordinarily hard for clients, absolutely, but it's also hard for practitioners as well.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything, that these are people who, often in this case, this is what they do. They help people for their job. But what should those people who are feeling that fatigue, what are some ways that they can get beyond that?
We're talking about practitioners?
Yes, just anyone experiencing that sort of fatigue.
Well, you can come to the School of Social Work at Tulane University's website, and there's a whole area focusing on self-care. But I think that there needs to be a recognition that you have gone through a hard time. You should not sweep it under the rug or pretend everything is fine. And I think most practitioners recognize that at a certain level. The other thing, too, is that I'm hoping that people who are affected by this, practitioners or otherwise, will take notes about this, that will write it down. Because when you're working with other traumatized people, they want to know that you've suffered, too. They want to know that you're not so cool and end up in these kinds of situations. So it provides a greater level of empathy that is very important for practitioners.
Yeah, and that seems to be true for just the average person, too, that just the acknowledgement of this is really hard.
Yes.
Seems to help people and provide some comfort.
Yes, they need to know that you're serious about this and that you have some degree of knowledge or authority related to it. But either way, just looking directly in someone's eyes and expressing your empathy is extraordinarily powerful for everybody, including the person who expresses it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Figley. I know we have a lot of questions at the end. We'll be circling back to you, but I'm going to move on to Dr. Francois. Hello, how are you doing?
Doing well. How are you, Emily?
I'm good. So your work centers on the effects of racism on mental health, and especially with children and how that sort of formulates how they see themselves in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So And this year, I know we've felt the impacts of racism in a different way than recent years. Why is that? What was the trigger that made events this year so different from even similar events in years before?
Mm-hmm. There have been other scholars and experts and writers who have examined that very question. I do think it's a really important question to ask, because, this is not the first time in our history, and when I say our, in the history of the United States, where we have seen these sorts of, widespread uprisings in response to violence that is racially motivated. But I think what's unique about what we saw over the spring and summer of this year, the uprisings that came about in response to some very high-profile killings of African Americans, is that it came at the time where the country and the world was already struggling with and grappling with and coming to terms with isolation that was tied to this pandemic, to the COVID-19 pandemic. And, we were already grappling with, okay, how do we navigate our lives through this public health crisis? And so we, at least in a US context, to have something as sort of viscerally violent happen, and to see it happening in the instance, for example, of George Floyd, I think pushed people, or rather, I should not push people, but made people respond to that particular incident in a way that may not have happened if people weren't already sort of charged with stressors related to isolation and navigating this public health crisis. So I do think it was sort of an effect of grappling with sort of dual or triple crises at the same time.
And especially because I think, coronavirus itself, people are seeing headlines that show it's affecting the Black community at a much higher rate. And so, you see that headline, you see this video, and you're saying it just sort of piled up and triggered this uprising.
Absolutely, yes. I do think that that has been an impact as well, or has had an effect as well. The knowledge, the data are demonstrating that this particular health crisis, much like many other physical and mental health conditions, are having disparate effects for African Americans. Much more severe effects and outcomes. So I do absolutely think that was a factor in, again, how just the accumulated or cumulative effect of navigating this health crisis with sort of the ongoing social crises around race that exist in this country.
And you've studied how Katrina impacts children and maybe when they were 5 and how they think about it now when they're entering adulthood. We talked a little bit about before this about the imagery associated with Katrina. How is that similar, or how does it compare to what we're seeing about things like the death of George Floyd and COVID-19?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the linkages, particularly for young people who are experiencing and navigating these disasters and potentially traumatic events. And the reason why I say potentially is because if we think back to how Dr. Figley defined what trauma is, an individual has to appraise that particular event or incident as traumatic. An incident or event in and of itself isn't traumatic. So children and adolescents are, I think, vulnerable in a unique way as they are experiencing and navigating events like a Hurricane Katrina, and all of the ways in which that particular disaster disparately affected young people and African Americans across the Gulf South. And then if we think about in New Orleans in particular, that were really sort of tied to economic and social factors that are not necessarily due to Katrina, but really sort of the systemic structure of our societies and our country. And I think that is, I think that in that way, how young people, children and adolescents, particularly African-American children and adolescents, navigated the stressors of Katrina can be linked to how they are navigating stressors around the current public health crisis of COVID-19, and then sort of this, the uprisings around racial violence that we saw over the spring and summer of this year as well, in that it is about the incident or the event in and of itself. However, what links them together and what ties together the ways in which those incidents are affecting African American children and adolescents is because they are tied to deep systemic structural ways in which our society, our communities, our country is structured along racial lines and along economic lines. And that has real consequences for how children and adolescents are developing in terms of their mental health, their cognitive health, their educational outcomes, and so on.
And you've said, a child sees an image of Katrina, a child sees an image a headline that says, Blacks dying at a higher rate of coronavirus. What does that do to a kid's brain?
Mm-hmm. Well, they start to make connections, right? And the connections are both neural as well as cognitive connections. And they're also making those connections based on not just what they're seeing in media, but what they're seeing in their everyday lives. So they may see family members, friends, and family members of friends who are, for example, contracting COVID-19 and having really severe outcomes. And, we tend to move in environments that are pretty homogeneous in terms of race and ethnicity and economically. So they can see those sort of headlines or news reports, but even more so, I think what's even more compelling for them making those connections is that they may be seeing it in their immediate environments, in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in their communities, and amongst their families, and they're seeing how these particular disasters and crises are affecting their loved ones, and make that connection that, I have certain may have certain risks present. I may be vulnerable in these ways. And on top of that, and I think the other piece that gets connected through media and also their immediate environment. So if you think of media as a more distal context, but their more immediate context is that in terms of the factors to protect me and promote wellness for me and people that look like me may not be readily available and accessible, or not available and accessible in the same ways.
So how do we address racism-based trauma? Like, I know maybe the protests are a way of, addressing it both personally and politically. Why is that? And how else can we address it?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the really first ways of addressing it is to acknowledge that it is a source of trauma. If I may go back to, again, Dr. Figley's definition of what a trauma is, or, how we come to appraise something as traumatic. It's an event or incident that happens, in an instant. It could be very short term, but it has long-term reverberating physical, emotional, social impact and consequences. And racist incidents and events, or incidents and events that can be tied to, interpersonal, systemic, structural racism are appraised as traumatic events. So I think that's the critical first step, is that, and when I say we, I mean, certainly the helping professional communities that are charged with identifying and diagnosing and providing the interventions and treatments to individuals and communities that have experienced individual level trauma or collective trauma. Recognizing that experiences of racism are indeed sources of trauma for people. And I think the other piece of that is also understanding sort of the complexity of racism as a source of trauma, in that it can manifest in an individual interpersonal way. So I had an individual level experience that I associated with racism, and it was traumatic for me, but then there's also this collective experience as well. So for example, witnessing, for example, George Floyd's killing could be experienced as that secondary trauma. Dr. Figley talked about secondary trauma that could be experienced on a collective level. But what is, that source of trauma is tied to, and again, it is about the individual, the group that appraises a particular incident as traumatic. And so a part of that appraisal is tied to it being around race, racially motivated, or racism. So I think those are sort of the two critical pieces, as that we acknowledge that racial discrimination and racism are sources of trauma at the individual level, but also at the collective level as well.
Yeah, so that same acknowledgement and really being specific and giving it a name, I think, like you said, it is helpful. All right, so I'm going to circle back to you with a few questions at the end, and we're going to go to Dr. Michelle B. Moore. Hi, Dr. Moore.
Hi.
So we have received a lot of questions about children, schools, their parents. And I think, especially right now, as people are going back to school, not going back to school, learning in home, people really are concerned, and it's for the kids and the parents. So what is the impact for virtual school on children and their parents?
It's hard because we've never done this before, so we don't exactly know what the impact is. However, we do know this is stressful. It's stressful for children. It is stressful for parents. It's stressful for teachers. So it's not something that I don't find anyone who's really really embracing it and enjoying it at this moment. In some way, I think it'll give us an appreciation for school and appreciation for the school buildings and being able to go back to them one day and actually be with our classmates and with our teachers in person. But for the time being, I think it's really hard to adapt to this virtual platform. People did it back in March whenever COVID began. And it was quite haphazard then because it was sudden and, you had to make the adjustment very quickly. And now people have had some more time to plan. And so I think virtual learning certainly looks different starting this fall semester than it did ending the spring. But it isn't without its challenges. I mean, expecting children to sit in front of a screen for extended periods of time, one of the things we promote is decreasing screen time all the time. Yet this is something that you have to enhance screen time and have more of it while we're doing school online. So it's hard for kids to adjust to that. It's hard to adjust to that interactive nature of being in the classroom online and how to be able to do that. And then we know you're missing out on the social interactions, which, as we know, for children is so important. That social component is important.
And even for kids who are going back to school, we've seen they go back to school, someone has coronavirus, we quarantine for 2 weeks. Oh, wait, there's a hurricane coming. Don't go to school. There's so much disruption. Is that normal for children? Are they able to adapt to that?
Is it normal? I don't think we can say it's normal to have that many disruptions, and it's so anxiety provoking. And like you said, so you start out school, you have to wear your mask, school is different. People are talking about being in pods. So you stay with your pod all day. And so you are, even though you're socializing at school, you're still limiting, right? School doesn't feel normal necessarily. And yes, we're about to come up to possibly another hurricane system that's going to disrupt school. So, and those disruptions aren't necessarily abnormal for us in Southeast Louisiana. We are accustomed to hurricane season at the start of school and having disruptions when potential hurricanes are coming through. But it's kind of piling all of that on to the existing stress and anxiety that already exists that I think the parents are experiencing. And so much of that is really weighing on our parents with having kids at home. And being able, how do you talk to kids about going to school with a mask on? And what if a child in your class gets COVID? Do they worry about getting COVID and what that experience is like? And parents being able to have, really being the therapist for their children, right? And having a lot of those conversations at home now.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned that they're missing out on the social interaction, which, you know, they can blow off steam, and they're developing, right? They're developing their sense of social intelligence. And so I'm interested to hear what is happening in different age groups. Like I have friends who had a child in March and their kid has never seen anyone. And their parents are worried. They don't know what faces look like because everyone has a mask on. And then I have, you know, a 17-year-old cousin who's frustrated, and, you know, everything in between. Who do you worry about most? What's going on with each age group?
Yeah, I don't think that there's necessarily an easy age group for any child that's involved, but because, like you said, socialization, that social interaction is part of humans' development. Like, we all need social interaction no matter what age. And right, so for the infants, and sometimes for infants, you know, we'll kind of start and work our way up through the trajectory. Just being home with your caregivers and having those interactions can be enough. You know, all you need is really your primary caregivers and somebody to give you that love when you're really little. So those kind of early years, I think it's okay to just be home and have, as long as you have some supportive people at home who aren't overly stressed and overwhelmed. I think that's the component that adds to things, is when your caregivers are really stressed and they're very anxious and possibly depressed, dealing with their own mental health issues, that has an impact on the child. So we're talking about socialization, but in thinking of who you're socializing with and who you're home with, right, it's going to have an impact on then how that child develops. So if you're being raised by very, very stressed out caregivers, that's going to have an impact on that young child. And then kind of working your way up, our elementary school age kids, who maybe they get some social interaction from virtual time with other kids, but it's probably unlikely. So they're probably missing out on the most of that social time. Because for our adolescents, middle school through adolescents, if they have a phone or if they have a device, adolescents, they have another way to be able to connect with friends. And they're accustomed to being able to do video chat and things like that. So that mode of interacting and socializing isn't as abnormal for adolescents. However, they really like to have their peer group is one of the most important people in their world right now. So for our adolescents in typical development, you're gravitating more towards your peers and less towards your family. And now a lot of them are kind of stuck with their families at home all the time, and they really need to be out with their peers and developing that sense of who they are and understanding their own identity. So we have different struggles at all the different age points. But that socialization is certainly something important. And I think we may see some long-term effects of missing out on socialization for so long.
What will those long-term effects be?
I mean, it's so hard to say, you know, because we've never been through this before. We've never been through a pandemic before, and people have never been isolated from each other for this period of time. I do think when you think of different people's personality types, sometimes that can play a role. So I've heard some people say who are very introverted, who like to be by themselves, like to kind of stay to themselves, and particularly for children, they're really happy to be home all day and to not have to go to school because school is anxiety provoking, and they are socially anxious. And so it's easier for them to be home for our introverted children. But then for our extroverted children, the ones who are really outgoing and who really like to kind of be the center of attention and the middle of things, and they're struggling. They're having a hard time of not being able to have those outlets, because I think socialization is a big outlet for children.
Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it sounds like the way caregivers are approaching this really has an effect on the children, right? So is there anything that caregivers can do to kind of keep their mental health in check?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a lot of things caregivers can do, and but it's also really, I think part of it is this kind of validation we've been talking about this morning, of validating that this is stressful, that this is hard, right? On whatever scale you're doing this on. If you're working from home and homeschooling, that is stressful. If your child is at school and you're working from home, like any component that you're experiencing, it's overwhelming, and you're allowed to kind of have that validation of this is very difficult and very stressful for me. And I think that self-care component that we talked about before, being able to engage in self-care, which is different than coping. Coping is stopping to take deep breaths, being able to calm yourself down, being able to manage those kind of heightened emotions that come up, and in the moment kind of dealing with that distress as it comes up. Whereas our self-care is our exercise, eating well, being able to maintain social contact, even if it is virtually, doing these things to take care of ourselves on more of a daily basis, and really paying attention to, I'm feeling overwhelmed today. Maybe today's my day to take a mental health day, to take a day off. Just because you're working from home doesn't mean you still can't take a day off. You have annual leave days if that's what your job allows for. And so being able to acknowledge that. And for our families where there's financial stressors and where you're not able to work right now, and you've added this whole other level of stress onto your plate, I think sometimes being able to just acknowledge that today was good enough. I can't, this day's not going to be perfect. I'm not going to be able to do it all. What sometimes is just kind of the bare minimum. I can make sure that we got up, we had some breakfast, we had something to eat, that we all talked to each other, right? We had some positive interaction just among family members, whoever we're living with in our kind of close-knit community. And sometimes that might just be good enough for today. So realizing that there's no expectation that you're going to be really happy and have all these really joyful moments, not having those expectations of yourself, and allowing yourself to have this ebb and flow of emotion, and to be able to manage that ebb and flow and regulate those emotions as they come up.
So a little bit of that same acknowledgement, and then also lowering the bar of what we can expect from ourselves right now.
Correct.
All right. So I'm going to go to the questions now. And there are a lot. We're going to try to get through as many as we can. If you sent one in and you don't see it answered, it may be because we've addressed it, or we're addressing it through a different question. So the first one, do you think this is harder for children who are older now but went through the trauma of Hurricane Katrina and now this pandemic?
I don't think it will matter. I think that it depends on what age they were, but it's going to be extraordinarily difficult. As was mentioned by Michelle, and I think Samantha as well, that we've never gone through anything like this. There's no track record. There's no references, if you will, for studies that have been done. My guess is that I have found, and I don't have statistics to demonstrate this, but for people who have gone through a traumatic event and they then go into another traumatic event, even if it's exactly the same thing, they're going to feel better. They're going to feel more prepared. They're going to have stories to tell. They're going to be able to say, this is not really a big deal compared to. And that in and of itself is helpful, and it starts the conversation in another direction. It enables people to, look deep down and see, in effect, are they a survivor? Have they gone through similar sorts of things, really? What does the rest of the panel have to say? I'm curious. Michelle, Samantha, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it is hard to say. And when you think of Katrina being 15 years ago, and so at the different ages of that people were and how old they are now. And I think for a lot of children, you hear the stories of your other family members, and so you kind of have that secondary trauma of hearing the story from somebody else, and then being able to say, well, what does that mean for me? But I do think that children of today are certainly living in a very different time than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So I think their outlook and their story is going to be quite different than children 15 years ago.
Yeah, I've heard people say things like, oh, I was, 5 years old when September 11th happened and changed the world. And then, coming into my formative years during Katrina, and then the financial crisis, and then now this, and you can do that for any age group, right? You can kind of situate yourself around disasters, but you're right that they each teach us things.
Mm-hmm.
All right. The next question is, I'm a 61-year-old male with no family. I have a severe lung disease with a low immune system due to steroids. I tend to stay in my darkened bedroom, which I know is not healthy, but it makes me feel safe. I do have friends that stop by and we maintain social distancing. I'm yearning for a hug. Any suggestions other than coming out of the dark bedroom?
My first suggestion is you do have to come out of the dark bedroom at some
Oh, no.
You do. And that's the hardest part. It's motivating yourself to be able to take that one step forward. And I do think that's what a lot of people are struggling with of, do I reconnect with my family members? Do I allow one person in for that hug? You know, of being able to identify when is it time to do that and how do I know when it's time? But at some point you do have to start to step out of the dark bedroom because you can't stay in there forever. That's not healthy.
And I just want to acknowledge for that individual that he mentioned that he is having friends come over and doing some social distancing. So he is stepping out of that dark bedroom, right? So I think it's important for him to acknowledge the steps that he's already taken and start to lean into those a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Nicely put. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. This person says, why do people not wearing masks not even consider people fighting cancer or survivors? Where does this selfish attitude come from? You know, maybe someone can shed some light on the psychological decision-making that comes with mask wearing.
I will start, but I'm not sure if I have an answer, actually. In many ways, it really depends on where they live, what their political attitudes are, their past experiences. But let me just tell you a very quick story. I'm down at the beach here. My daughter and her two children, her husband left a little bit earlier than that to go to work. But we finally, after how many months, since March or whatever, Kat and I, my wife and I, haven't seen the children, face to face. So it was thrilling and wonderful. And we followed all the procedures, but I just came in the house and started hugging them. And I really didn't recognize, and the kids didn't know either. They're young, relatively young. And my daughter really didn't say anything because she was happy that they were hugging me, I guess. But then my wife told me and explained to me in as kind of terms as possible that that's not very healthy. And I do appreciate it. You need to have a mask on, etc. But it was so hard to be away from your grandchildren and not be able to go up and hug them. So I certainly understand. And so the person who is complaining, they really don't know where that person is coming from, the people that don't wear masks. There may be, some extenuating circumstances, ignorance, for example, on my part, because I haven't had the opportunity really to interact with anyone. And it was a very, very difficult to hold back in terms of my grandchildren. And so the subsequent times that we met together, that didn't happen, but I think we definitely enjoyed each other's company. How about you guys? What do you think?
Yeah, it's not something I've examined in terms of data, but to Charles's point, I do think it's sort of a combination of factors to examine and understand why some people choose to wear masks and why others don't. As he mentioned, there could be political reasons for it. It could be because they don't have the information. There's a lack of information about, or a lack of understanding, I should say, not information, but lack of understanding or even access to information about the facts of what we know about how the virus is spread versus not spread. The one thing that I've encountered recently that I think is tied to that lack of understanding or lack of access to information is I've encountered folks who feel very strongly about not wearing masks, who believe that we're doing a disservice in terms of us developing an immunity to this virus by wearing the mask, by not letting ourselves be exposed to it. So I think just there's a a range of ideas and psychologies around people's decision to do or not do. And I think, it's on us, the quote unquote experts, and then also community members to try to help. And I think we can do a better job of this within our own. And I like how Michelle said our own little pods is kind of encouraging and sharing the accurate information about how to keep at least our pod safe, and and then hopefully it can reverberate outward to the larger communities.
And I'll just add really quickly to that. I think the frustration that comes in, for somebody asking a question of like, why don't people wear masks? There is some level of privilege with that feeling of, well, I can get sick because I'm not going to die from this. It's okay if I get sick because I'll develop my immunity. But like they're saying, some people don't have that privilege. If you're immune compromised and you have cancer, you're already fighting something else. And so stopping to think that this isn't just about you, right? That is that selfish component of it's about other people too. And if you were in their shoes, right, being able to have some understanding of what and empathy for what it would feel like if you had that family member who had cancer and who wasn't able to go out, how would that change your perspective?
Great point. This person says, I am experiencing indirect effects while working from home during the pandemic. Severe social anxiety when I do interact with people outside of my household, countered with extreme loneliness and irritability when I don't. Is this normal? What can I do about it? I relate with this to an extent. I'll just say it's normal, but this person sounds like they're experiencing more severe. Any advice?
I think it's that kind of overwhelming anxiety of it's the anxiety of going out and then the anxiety of staying in and the emotion that just is so difficult to regulate right now. So in some way, I would suggest to this person being able to sit with these moments, to be able to calm yourself down. I am going to go out. This is how I'm going to react to that. When I come back in, being able to readjust to all those different scenarios and accepting that this is just your way of being right now, and hopefully this won't be how it is forever. But for right now, having some acceptance of, this is overwhelming. It's overwhelming to go out. Yeah, it's overwhelming to stay in. How do I find a balance between these two things that feels good enough for me?
Yeah. I'm finding like social skills and even things like driving that we're not doing as much. Mm-hmm. It's almost like a muscle that needs to be worked. So I would, to this person, I guess I would say it's normal.
And let me just emphasize this, that it's normal, and the time that we're going through is extraordinarily abnormal, and it's hard for everyone, and we all have to figure it out. We never, this time last year, we never had to worry about masks, for example. Social distancing was odd and weird, and I'm not even sure I could estimate 6 feet, you see? So it is a tremendous shockwave that is still reverberating, and we're all still not used to it. And I think probably things will be better once we do get used to it and we don't have this stop and start problem. But it's a historic and extraordinary time.
So we're having sort of very normal reactions to an abnormal situation.
Precisely. Well put.
Okay, and our next question, how do you help a child that continuously talks to himself because of isolation and is a single child? Dr. Moore, maybe you want to.
Yeah, I think depending on the age of the child, that could be perfectly normal. For our young children, pretend play is a beautiful thing. So embrace that. And if you want to jump in and be a part of that story with them, then by all means do. But for a lot of children, being able to be in their own world and interact in this way can be really fun and exciting. And so there may be nothing wrong with it at all. So it really depends on the age of the child. If that child's 12, 10, an older child, then it might be something more concerned that you may want to go see a professional about. But if it's a young child, I think it's perfectly normal, and enjoy the pretend play era because it certainly is a lot of fun.
Is there anything with, children who are only children who are experiencing this a little differently from children with siblings?
You could say that they don't have that same kind of social interaction that people with siblings do because they have these built-in playmates. But I don't know that that's going to be dramatically different than when children typically grow up as only children. I don't know that you'll see kind of huge negative effects for those children versus children with siblings. But I suppose time will tell. We don't know that for a fact.
The interesting thing about this period of time is that parents are spending so much time with their children.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in many ways that's a good thing. It may not be good in a crowded sense, or that you feel the walls are closing in. But I know it's true for my daughters as with their children, and and I've seen this elsewhere, that parents are getting to know their children at a very deep level, in times of a pandemic, in which there is uncertainty and the rules are not clear, and you're never quite exactly sure what to do under certain circumstances. It's very, very hard, and there needs to be some degree of, not tolerance, I guess, but acceptance of children's behavior in particular, because it's so difficult. We can analyze it, compare it with past events, apply theories and logic, but children are not that way. And for the most part, I think kids are doing tremendously well. I know that there are definitely reports and some research on this, but it's delightful to see that they're doing as well as they are.
Which hopefully is reassuring for parents that the kids are probably going to be okay.
They're going to be.
We have a couple more questions about virtual schooling. So I'm going to kind of combine these two. This person says, I've become a homeschool mom, teacher to my child. They have class online until further notice, 8:30 to 4 p.m., 5 days a week. I battle with depression and anxiety, not able to take her meds, and because she needs to be attentive to the child's school needs, lost her 2 jobs, no income coming in. They need internet and power to participate in school. She's worried about finances and distracted by her mental illness. What do you say to parents in that position? And then we also have someone asking, how can you motivate a child to sit at the kitchen table 5 days a week for 8 hours a day to do schoolwork? Great question.
You can't. So I'm going to start with that one. You can't motivate an adult to sit at a table for 8 hours a day in front of a computer. So, and I think, my understanding of what schools are doing and classroom teachers are doing is building into these virtual schedules ways in which they are giving young students and children opportunities to break up that time. Mm-hmm. And for those parents or caregivers that are more so managing that homeschooling process or distance learning process, they have to, kind of schedule in those natural breaks, because, for a child's, and again, this varies across age, but their ability to sort of attend to one thing and stay on task is time bound, right? And that time boundaries it's not 60 minutes. So forget about 8 hours. So you have to be flexible, and like I said, I think teachers and schools are doing that in how they're structuring the virtual learning opportunities, and caregivers that are taking that on as well. Schedule in those breaks, schedule in that time to go outside, to be not in front of the computer, but outside the 4 walls, if you have the ability to do that. So yeah, you have to break that time up, especially for young people.
Yeah, I would agree with what Samantha's saying. And I would say on those breaks, make sure that kids are getting away from devices. So don't take a break from the computer and pick up your phone and sit on your phone for the 15 minutes that you're on break. Go move your body. And right, if you're able to, go outside and get fresh air, get a kind of different environment for a little while. I think something else for parents too to think about. I agree that I don't think kids can sit in front of a computer for 8 hours. But being mindful of kind of what are they eating, what are they kind of putting into their bodies. If they're putting a lot of sugar, they're sitting and eating candy and drinking soft drinks while they're in school. Man, that's even harder to sit still. Right, you're going to get more fidgety depending on kind of what you're putting into your body, nutrition-wise. So being mindful of that as well. And for parents, a lot of parents have said, how do I get them to get motivated, get them to sit there? Don't get into power struggles. Try to limit power struggles with your kids over sit and pay attention, that some days they just might not be able to do it as well as they could on another day. And that's the same thing, for adults. So for parents to feel like, don't let this add more stress to your day, trying to make your child sit and pay attention. If they need to stand for a little while next to the computer, I think that's perfectly fine too. These are accommodations that teachers allow in the classroom, and teachers allow breaks during the classroom day. So parents are just now the aides of the classroom.
Gotcha.
I also think it's extraordinarily difficult for the teachers. I mean, I think everyone would acknowledge that. And I think that we don't really appreciate teachers that much during this pandemic. They have gone through a great deal and they need a lot of support. So I'm hoping that, as we're doing lessons and spending a lot of time, they're there also with even more children. So my hope is that the hearts will go out to these teachers.
Absolutely.
And Emily, I wanted to just say one thing also in response to the other question. It sounds like that individual, that parent / caregiver, has a whole host of challenges that they are confronting, that are financial, that are mental health related. There are right now, there are a lot of resources that are out there, in terms of resources to access for help with if you have experienced job loss and or unemployment at this time, reconnecting with mental health providers if you've been disconnected from your mental health care. So I think what I think is what could be important for us to do is, if there's any way we can kind of steer those into, or make that information available, because that may not be the only individual that's experiencing that range of challenges right now. Linking, like, for example, the New Orleans Health Department has put out a list of resources, as well as some other city departments and units, in terms of community level government agency resources that people can connect with at this time.
Gotcha. All right. And I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So I'm going to pick 2 that came up over and over again. And the first one, it kind of speaks to what we were talking about. People with autistic children wrote in a lot. They want to know their routines have been disrupted and they're not getting the support that they would any other time. Is there anything that they can do?
Certainly a challenge for those parents, no doubt. I think a parent of any child with a physical disability, emotional disability, who's struggling. I want to point out too, also our children with academic learning problems, and who are home and kind of missing out on some of those in-person learning opportunities. And for our children with autism, this obviously is going to be very difficult for them, because they have to establish new routines and new ways of getting through their day. What's this new transition going to be like? How do I adapt to this new transition? And all of that is falling on the parent. So I feel like that's when the stress comes back for the parents of those children, because they have to be the ones to put these new plans into place and the new transitions into place. And so it's a lot for parents. And if those parents are able to connect with their children's typical teachers, and if the teachers are able to work with the parents and they can work in tandem to help the children, I think that would be the best case scenario when they're able to work as a team, because typically being a team and being able to help our children is really the best way to go about it.
Okay. And then the last question, a few people have written in, They saying, why are African Americans being forced to return to these jobs that already have COVID-19 exposures when we have a higher health risk due to medical conditions? And someone else is saying, what do you do when you're trying to reach out for help with mental health? And this person says, nowadays in the African American community, many are afraid to seek help. It sounds like she or he is asking a question about stigma within certain communities. What would you say to that person?
Yeah, so in terms of the first question, and there is data that demonstrate this, that African Americans and Latinx folks are more likely to work in what we are now calling essential jobs, or be among the essential workforce. So they are disproportionately are required to return to work or haven't been able to not work at this time. So I think, and because they are disproportionately working in that essential workforce, their incomes tend to be incomes that they cannot live without, right? So I think the onus then is on the companies, the organizations, the corporations with whom the African Americans and Latino folks are working with to make sure those working environments are safe and compliant with all of the safety measures that need to be in place in order to protect its employees' safety. And also, we have to make sure that our employees have access to the resources, access to testing resources, access to resources if they do come in contact and need to self-quarantine. And I think that, again, that onus is on the companies and the corporations and the organizations that are requiring this workforce to be present, as well as, kind of our larger jurisdictions as well. I'll say one more thing about the stigma piece, and I'll stop so that Dr. Figley or Dr. Moore can respond as well. That stigma around mental health care in the African American community has been around for a long time. Right, there's a lot of data on that. However, what we are also seeing in recent data are showing, and we also see it anecdotally, is that is starting to break down in a whole range of sort of smaller communities within the larger African American community, where it is not as what's the word I'm looking for, where there's not as much stigma around acknowledging that one needs mental health care support. So, for example, that in the church, where for a lot of African Americans, the church is a significant source of social support and spiritual support and emotional support. We see a lot of churches where African Americans are attending, advocating for the seeking of mental health care, particularly around the time of these disasters and crises that we are navigating through and that are disparately affecting African Americans. So I do think, I'm not saying that what this individual is saying around the stigma is not present, but I think there are many ways within African American communities that stigma is breaking down, and there's more support and encouragement for acknowledging mental health challenges and then seeking assistance for them.
Well, I'd like to kind of piggyback on what Dr. Francois is saying. Right, if you're working with a mental health professional and you have this feeling like they're stigmatizing you or they don't understand you or they're not really hearing you when you talk, let them know that. Yes. It's really important to communicate that because nobody should ever, you're not going to get anywhere with a mental health professional if you don't speak up about that. And if you're not honest with them about that relationship, there needs to be a good fit between you and that person that you're working with. And if that's not there, then you're not going to be able to accomplish your goals. But please try and share that information with them because they may not know how they're coming across. They may not know how racism is affecting you. They may not know how your financial struggles are really deeply impacting you because maybe they haven't experienced that. But let them know that. Let them know when you don't feel like you're being heard.
And I want to end on a positive note. Maybe, Dr. Figley, you had mentioned that we're spending more time with our families. Is there anything that this time at home, is there anything that is positive that will come out of this, even if it's hard right now? If anyone has anything they'd like to share.
I think I probably said all the positive things I could think of.
Mm-hmm.
What's important, and I know we're ending on a positive note, is that we're all together, that we're going through this. We're surviving so far. And I think this is going to be teaching us a lot eventually. But if we can just hold on to the people that we love and care about, and even if we can't hold on to them, if we can look at them and communicate with them as much as possible, we'll all get through this fine.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I think one positive piece I would want to share as we close is that something that we saw a lot of and I think got a lot of attention, in kind of those immediate months and few years following Hurricane Katrina and the devastation it did across the Gulf Coast, was how, at the ground level, if you will, at the community level, at the grassroots level, the ways in which communities and neighborhoods and people kind of got together to help each other recover and rebuild and get through. I think that is, that's something that naturally happens in the midst of a disaster or crisis, is that people will start to come together and say, okay, this is what we're missing and this is what we need. How do we work together to get that, to fill those gaps, be it around housing, mental health care, food, in the case of natural disasters or hurricanes, rebuilding a home or finding housing. I think that, and I think we see examples of that in the context of the crisis and the crises that we're in right now, is that at the community level, at the neighborhood level, people are coming together to sort of work these things out and figure out the answers. And then also hold the power holders accountable.
Yes.
As well.
My positive note I'll end on will be about parent-child relationships, because we've talked quite a bit about that, being home with your kids and being able to embrace that time as much as possible. Kids are only kids once, and once they grow up and they're out of your house. And even then, you know that they're going to stress you out and you're going to get frustrated with them and, being home together all day. But if you can find those moments to really appreciate that joy of being with your children, if your children are healthy, being able to be with those healthy children and appreciating and having gratitude for what you have right in front of you.
Gotcha. Well, thank you all so much. What you have said is so valuable, and we just so appreciate it. And that's it. And I hope everyone stays safe as this storm comes to us. And thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is John Reneden. I am the founder of the Reneden Foundation, and we connect people and businesses with resources to help come back from this pandemic. Our tagline is get help, give help. We try and put the people together, or businesses together, with both the resources that they may need in order to come back after this pandemic. It touches on everything from mental health to jobs, donations. We also partner with people and organizations that want to give help. We can act as a conduit. If they don't know how to help, they can come to us and we can provide that so that they can help. So I started the Reneden Foundation because my life kind of brought me there. I came from a very supportive family with resources, but due to my own mental health issues, I ran from them. And for 10 years, they didn't even want to speak with me, and I didn't blame them. I was homeless and all sorts of things happened, but then I found out I could reach out for help, which is what I did. And it's a big reason why we started the foundation, is because we want to be that resource to where you can ask for help, but you have to ask for help. And we want to connect those resources with you. So the Reneden Foundation is going to be a conduit. We're going to be a resource. If you go to the website, It's going to be growing. We're working with the mental health aspects right now because so many people are suffering from this pandemic. I mean, we've seen so many of these mental health issues skyrocket through this. If you need resources financially or through mental health, we're going to have those resources there. Now, if you are somebody or a business or an organization that can help us, you can partner with us and be a resource for these people coming back or these businesses coming back that need to know where to go, what to do. The Renedin Foundation has already assisted some organizations such as Habitat for Humanity. We got a call that they needed PPE or masks specifically for low-income communities that could not provide it. So we provided that for them so that they could get it to the community that needed it. Also, the SBCA in Jefferson, they had national organizations that had to bring some of their resources back. So these nonprofits really got hit during this time. So we donated what we needed to in order to help them try and get through this pandemic until they could find more resources, because people are not donating and they're not helping as much. They're worried, they're afraid. Seeking help changed my life to where I could become part of the community again and help people. I could become, an active part of my own family. I was separated. So thankfully, I have been working on that for years, but right now I've seen so many people struggling, and I thought that this is a topic that most people don't want to talk about, but it needs to be talked about, especially right now. It's okay, ask for help, because that is a mental health thing, the anxiety, the fear. But everyone's going through this, but it's a topic that needs to be talked about because we keep seeing people hurting more and more every day. If you are somebody or a business or an organization that can help us, we would love to have some other partners to help people within the community. Please visit therenedinfoundation.org to get help or to give help to those in need.